Hi, folks, and welcome to Changing Minds, the program that looks to understand human behavior through the lens of psychology and neuroscience. I'm your host, Joe Devlin, and today's topic is the extra task facing so many families these days, that is homeschooling. The school is closed for the majority of kids. Many parents have to struggle teaching their children with full-time work and with family life. It's a pretty daunting task. With me to discuss this today is Professor Sandra Dunsmuir, Professor of Educational and Child Psychology and Director of the UCL Educational Psychology Department. Welcome, Sandra.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on. And it's always good to know that our sound and everything is working. So we're off to a good start. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Sandra, please share them in the Q&A board as we go, and we'll get to them towards the end. So Sandra, if we could just get started, I guess at a personal level, I feel pretty lucky because both of my girls are grown up now. I mean, one's a doctor at the NHS and the other is just finished A-levels. So I'm not doing homeschooling, but it does seem like the new unaccountable task that everyone is facing these days. And it does seem pretty challenging for everyone.
Yeah.
What is it that, what is it that people are facing? I mean, how do they accommodate this new add-in to their life?
I mean, they are unprecedented times, and it's brought disruption and challenges for us all. But for parents who are trying to combine jobs with educating their children, it can feel particularly tough. So I think my first message is there's no such thing as getting homeschooling right. That's a pressure that parents don't need. What we're talking about is all about compromises and balance. Now, what we do know is that homeschooling brings a whole series of parental worries. I mean, I'm an educational psychologist and I talk to colleagues delivering services about the nature of parental concerns. And anecdotally, they seem to fall into three groups. One is anxiety. One is to do with behaviour and relationship difficulties. And the third is people seeking advice about home learning. So I'll say a little about each of those. And what I'll try and do is everything I say will be based in psychological research. And it's the sort of evidence base that guides practice for educational psychologists. So first of all, anxiety. I mean, worries for anyone can feel overwhelming. And children may mention that they're worried, or parents may notice that their behaviour changes, so they might become more clingy. For parents, it's really important to try and encourage them to be open and honest about their worries, to listen to them and give them space. Good idea not to have these talks when you're tired and stressed and your child is tired and stressed, like before bedtime. And it's also a good idea not to interrogate them, but to find a time when they're willing to talk about their concerns. When they do tell you what's worrying them, acknowledge them, validate them, and let your child know that, if they're COVID related, it's perfectly understandable to feel scared. It might be that there are some misunderstandings there. There are some myths circulating, and you might have to gently correct any myths. There's actually a really good BBC Newsround website that's a myth-busting website, and I would recommend pointing children in that direction. It's also helpful to help children think about worries they can do something about and those that they can't, because if something isn't under their control, it's important to learn to tolerate the worry and focus on other things. Parents can be great models of coping strategies and can talk to children about what they can do to help them feel calm. So a parent's job really is to listen and to empathise, hear what they say and advise accordingly. So, for example, if your child's worried about someone else, like maybe a grandparent, try and find ways to make them feel more socially connected. And, we've all been practicing with all the social media platforms that have opened up to us in the last couple of months. There's also lots of publicly available advice about talking to children about COVID-19. Some of it is really, really good and sound. Second area that parents have expressed concerns about relate to behaviour difficulties in children or relationship difficulties in families. And, you know, with regard to homeschooling, some parents are finding real problems with getting their children to attend to work and be motivated to complete work. In those sorts of instances, I would probably point towards the literature on negotiation and negotiation strategies, which mean taking into account the outcome that you want, like getting your child to complete this particular piece of work, versus the relationship. And sometimes it's important to renegotiate rules and then communicate these really clearly to children in a way that doesn't threaten the relationship. With younger children, you can do great things with drawings and visual reminders to help make absolutely explicit what the rules are. But, you know, everybody's life has changed, and we're all needing to rethink how we run our lives and the boundaries around them.
Yeah, that's the truth.
Yeah. And I mean, family disagreements, you know, people stuck together who wouldn't normally have spent intense time together to the degree that families are now having to do. And we do all get angry. Everybody gets angry. People do lose their tempers, but it's especially important to repair and restore relationships following disagreements. So the principles of restorative justice can be really helpful in thinking about what to do following a family disagreement. So encourage children to empathise and consider the perspective of other people in a non-confrontational way, to try to help them to understand the impact of their actions on others. Discussions about how to put things right, and then when a child does behave appropriately, praise them, reward them. You know, that approval will be really important to children. And as parents, you need to choose your battles. You know, identify behaviours you're prepared to endure, and 2 to 3 that you find intolerable. So you might decide you'll overlook the messy bedroom, but you'll be completely uncompromising about sibling violence. So in rethinking some of those things, and you know, you can't say no to everything, think in advance about what the consequences of particular behaviours will be, and let your children know in advance, and then be consistent and follow through. Parents have also expressed concerns about home learning, and you know, for parents with children with special educational needs and disabilities, it can be a really, really tough time at the moment. So we know that one group that have been really struggling have been children with autism spectrum disorders, who quite often have not managed changing routines very well and have had meltdowns. I think if you're a parent of a child with SEND and you need an individual consultation, my advice would be to contact your child's school or local educational psychology service, because interventions need to be really focused on the individual situation and the individual child's needs. If your concerns are about something like an aspect of learning, like literacy difficulties, talk to the school, talk to your child's teacher and ask for a programme. I mean, I've talked to some parents who have said, you know, in all of the disruption, there is an opportunity to do individualised, more intensive work with children at home that would have been difficult whilst going out to work. So those are the kind of broad concerns I've come about, but you know, it is challenging for everyone, not least teachers who themselves are very often parents and trying to manage working life at the same time and changes to working routines and practices.
Well, that was in fact one of the things I wanted to ask, because obviously the experts, other than you and your team, are our teachers, right? I mean, and I wonder how the communication works between parents and teachers, because there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about how our kids are doing in school and what works and what doesn't. Is there an avenue that parents can perhaps be speaking with the schools at some level?
Oh, I mean, homeschool communication is really, really important. And but schools are very different. Schools have found themselves in a new situation and been left to their own devices. Very often, you know, head teachers in consultation with their staff have had to come up with ways of delivering learning, delivering it remotely that suits them and the situation that they find themselves in. But schools, some of them are being absolutely great about keeping in contact with parents, and the way that they do that will vary. But I would say to any parent that has any concern or questions at all, get in touch with the school, ask to talk to your child's teacher, because that communication is at the centre of effective learning, and working in tandem, hand in hand, is the way that we will find out what works best for individual children and groups of children.
That makes a ton of sense. And one of the things you sort of allude to there is the fact that, of course, the homeschooling isn't a new phenomenon. I mean, the scale at the moment is unprecedented.
Yeah.
But people have studied homeschooling, right? You've studied homeschooling. Are there things that we know about things that work or don't work?
Well, I haven't actually studied homeschooling. I'm obviously very interested in education and educational psychology. And what I can't do is offer a series of top tips, but I can provide some broad advice based on psychology research that might provide a framework about how to manage home learning. I mean, what individual families do will vary depending on their situation, the developmental level of the child, the age of the child, the interests and the needs of children, and parent demands. I mean, some parents are home working with a full-time job. Some parents are going out of the home as key workers. So that obviously will change it. And the other variable in all of this is how schools have decided to approach teaching and learning. But the most important thing, I think, to bear in mind is that parents are children's primary educators. Children learn at home long before they start school, and that continues once they're at school. You know, they learn to walk and talk, they learn about how to interact with the world, not through school, but through their families and the interactions at home. And then when they get to statutory school age, parents hand over the care of their children to the school, who act as in loco parentis. And there's a change, because once children start school, learning becomes much more formalised and disembedded. And home environments are not normally set up for formal learning. So the first thing that families have had to try and scrabble together is creating a learning environment where distractions are limited. So that means turning off the TV and turning off phones, and creating an environment that helps children to focus. You know, nowadays access to a computer is good, but not everybody has that. But there is a well-documented relationship, as I said, between homeschool liaison and parental involvement in education is linked with positive learning outcomes, especially with literacy and to a lesser extent numeracy. It may be a comfort to know that less is known about the impact of parental intervention on other parts of the curriculum. You know, so for a parent that doesn't understand the detail of some scientific experiment, it probably won't make that much difference to the child. Because I know a lot of parents worry about that. They just are not familiar with the modern curriculum. So our research was on homeschool trust, and the building of a trusting relationship between homes and schools is correlated with better attainment at all academic levels. So, you know, trust is benevolence, it's reliability. If somebody says they're going to do what they, you know, does what they say they're going to do. It's competency, it's doing something well and operating in an honest and open manner. And if trust is lacking, people become defensive and withhold information. So now, more than any time, it's important that there are trusting relationships between parents and teachers. I mean, we know from our research that there are higher levels of trust at primary than secondary school, and there's also more communication between parents and teachers at primary than secondary level. But in fact, our research indicated that it's the quality rather than the quantity of communication that's associated with higher trust. So that's why I say you have to talk, you have to approach your child's teacher with concerns, because, you know, at the heart is the child, and they're at the interface of home and school. So they are the thing that adheres parents and children's teacher and parent interests, and that's the common goal, is positive outcomes for the child. So yeah, trust is important. But I mean, other things that we know, there have been meta-analyses of learning, teaching approaches that are associated with effective learning, and a number of the things that have come out of that sort of research, any parent can do and don't depend on a detailed knowledge of the curriculum. So the first thing is feedback. So there are, you know, lots of studies that show that teachers that seek feedback from children about their learning and then adjust what happens on the basis of the feedback are more effective teachers, and parents can do this too. So feedback is most powerful when it's provided by the child, and it is about what they know, what they understand, where they make mistakes and misunderstandings, and if they're not engaged, why they're not engaged. And then the subsequent support is adjusted to take account of that feedback. And it'll be most effective when it provides cues and reinforcers. So for a parent, it's just talking to their child about tasks that they're undertaking and trying to work out what they know, what they've learned, what they understand, what they don't understand, and then adjusting input to take that into account.
Okay.
There's another area that is spaced versus massed practice. We call that distributed learning. And this means that you don't have to sit down over a child 3 hours in a block and get them working. It's the frequency of different opportunities rather than spending more time on tasks that makes a difference. So it's much better to break a task down into 3 or 4 exposures over several days. That will lead to better learning outcomes, and there's a reasonable probability that that will be embedded. Children will learn and remember that. So different presentations, different ways of doing it. Watch BBC Bitesize, practice using different means, but it can lead to learning being fun rather than drill and practice, which is dull and repetitive.
That's got to be a relief for, I think, a lot of us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this idea that there isn't a one size fits all, and that by interacting with your kids and getting their feedback, and also not sitting over them for such a long time. Related to that, how important is kind of a routine? I mean, in school they would have one, but at home that's got to be a bit harder. What do we do on that side?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question. I mean, routine can sound really dull and disciplinarian, but it's so important because it provides children with a sense of safety, predictability, and containment. It's also really important at establishing and maintaining healthy habits. So don't hesitate to structure your children's days. They're not used to setting a pace for themselves. Someone usually does it for them at school or at home. And actually a lack of structure can lead to problems. It can lead to idleness, flitting from one activity to another without finishing anything, not seeming interested in anything but passive activities like watching TV. And the effect as time wears on is to disrupt waking, sleeping, and meal times, particularly with teenagers. And, you know, for parents, it could mean that children interrupt all the time and ask for input and attention many, many, many times during the day. So routine and structure is really important. And it is a good idea to invest time in working out that structure, negotiating the structure. So, you know, take a couple of hours to explain to children the advantages of planning their day and negotiate a weekly schedule that should include, as well as, you know, work, intellectual activities, creative activities, physical activity, relaxation. It's okay to watch the TV when it's part of the schedule. You might want to build in times when older kids keep the younger ones busy, times where young people can have virtual contact with their friends, and moments when parents play or work or do something with the children. I mean, all of those can be built into the schedule and make the children feel they're part of the planning, though, so they've got some ownership of it, because that means they're more likely to stick to it. Teenagers can be resistant to routine, but if that happens, be consistent, stay calm, keep the dialogue open, because, you know, avoidance of escalation of conflict is really important with teenagers. So if that happens, just remove yourself from the situation and return to the issue when everyone feels far calmer and more receptive to addressing it. But once set, do all you can to respect and adhere to the schedule.
And for parents, I mean, it's obvious that this is putting a lot of extra burden and stress on them. Is it even possible to sort of burn out? I mean, you would at work, but it seems like a sort of similar environment. That's got to be tough for a parent.
Yes, I mean, parents can burn out. We've been involved in an international study on parental burnout, and it occurs everywhere in the world where parents have enduring exposure to chronic parenting stress. So, you know, what are the signs of parental burnout? Well, there are kind of 3 dimensions to it. One is exhaustion relating to the parent role, and that is physical and emotional. The second is an emotional distancing from children. And the third is what we call loss of parental efficacy, which means feeling like a really ineffective, useless parent. And it happens when there's an imbalance, a chronic imbalance between parental demands, stressors, and parental resources, you know, all the sort of protective, alleviating factors that people have in their lives. And now is a time when some parents will be particularly vulnerable to parental burnout. And, you know, it can be bad for parents who might be irritable, feel guilty, ashamed, loathe themselves. At its most extreme, have thoughts about suicide and family escape. For children, it can make them vulnerable to neglect and violence. And for couples, for partnerships, it can lead to distance between them and conflicts. And actually for parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities, they face additional threats to their psychological needs. So it is really important to recognise when parents are feeling burned out and seek help. And that can take a number of forms. It might be talking to a partner or a friend, but I would say talk to a professional if necessary. You know, sometimes it is important to seek professional help. And, you know, take the pressure off. Aim to be a good enough parent. I really like that expression. It was coined by Donald Winnicott. You don't have to be all things to all people. Being good enough is sufficient, particularly at the moment. You're not a bad parent if you change certain rules to make it easier to live together during this period. That's okay. And part of looking after yourself as a parent and making sure you're, you know, fit for the job is self-care. You know, whatever lifts your spirits, exercise, relax, connect with friends on Zoom, try to have fun, share a joke, slow down and give yourself permission to focus on your own needs. You know, if you want to be able to try and continue working at home and be an available parent and replace teachers, you're not going to do it. It's not possible. You're heading for burnout. So you have to choose and accept that to choose means to give something up. So, you know, I would just say exceptional situations call for exceptional measures.
I'll buy that for sure. If it's okay, Sandra, I'd love to turn to some questions from the audience. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So one of the really practical and sensible questions I see here is, realistically, how much time would you expect a primary school child, a key stage 1 to 3 age child, to sit at a table learning during the day?
That's the $60,000 question. You know, I think it can't be the major activity in the day, you know, 6 hours at the desk like you are at school. It has to be balanced. And I would say, you know, I can't give you an amount of time. I don't think anyone would expect me to, but it's part of this negotiation of the daily structure. And as I said, schools are very variable, and in terms of expectations, what parents are being asked to do, again, that's variable too. But if it feels like too much and you're having difficulties, talk to the school. Think of it as a point of negotiation, because schools are learning too. You know, teachers are making those judgments as well, and they can only adapt what they're doing if it feels like too much on the basis of feedback that they receive.
And presumably, I mean, just harking back to one of the points you raised earlier about spaced learning, this idea that it doesn't all need to be at once. You know, 4 sessions of 15 minutes might be more effective than an hour at, you know, at a time. So
yeah, as long as there are threads of continuity. But yeah, distributed learning is effective.
And another question that we have here, which is thinking about it from a larger society perspective, is, you know, do you think that current homeschooling situation will increase or decrease the differences between students in poor and rich families?
Okay. I mean, there's a lot about this, and I think this is one of the biggest concerns, is the potential for the current situation to exacerbate social inequalities. I mean, the statistic that you know, schools have remained open for the children of key workers and for children defined as vulnerable. So those are children with education, health and care plans, or with social care involvement. And only 2 to 5% of those groups are actually attending school and taking up their school places. And what we don't know is what is happening at home. And I think we have a lot of important research that we have to do as a result of this to find out what is actually happening, what practices are developing, and what's going to happen when schools have returned. You know, for children who maybe are a bit behind, how can we get interventions to them once they're back at school to support their learning? But I know this is a really great concern of lots of us.
Yeah, it's one of the big society questions at this point.
Yeah.
There's another, you know, practical parenting teaching question here, which is, you know, if the child doesn't follow his or her planning, what kind of feedback should parents give? Should they be punishing their child? Should they be rewarding them when they're getting it right? What's the way to balance that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, without question, reward and positive reinforcement is a far more effective strategy than punishment. Punishment doesn't change behavior. If you punish your child, it doesn't make it more likely that they're going to adhere to the schedule the next day. So I think it's having a discussion with the child about the schedule and what the problems are. If it becomes a source of conflict, try and catch the good and reward it. Even if it's just 10 minutes sticking to the schedule and you wanted them to stick to it for an hour, catch the good and reward it, praise them, make it worth their while. It's much more effective as a strategy for changing behaviour to shape it up using positive strategies than punishment, which just isn't very effective.
Fantastic. I'm sensitive to the fact that we're running a little bit long. It's such a deep topic with so much, that we could cover. My apologies if you have a question here that we haven't gotten to. Sandra, I can imagine that there'll be a lot of folks who have, looking for more information, and you've very generously shared some links. I just want to share the screen here real briefly. First, in terms of just acknowledging what you said earlier, we were talking about acknowledging the situation for the child, but of course there's this picture you shared about acknowledging it for the parent, right?
Someone sent me that postcard when my children were small, and it was in a frame on my kitchen wall for years and years and years, and it resonated with me. And I think on top of that, we've got coronavirus. So however difficult multitasking can feel in normal life, it can be even greater now. So yeah, that picture sums up an awful lot. Yeah,
I buy that. And then if we talk about a couple of the quick resources, these will be in the video, but they'll also be available online and the YouTube recording of this. But since they're here, maybe you could just walk us through a couple of these.
Well, there's so much stuff, honestly. I've got files and files of it, but there's almost too much information to know what to do with it. So I've just picked out a few under 4 categories. So if you're looking for general advice, the British Psychological website has resources for parents and professionals on responding to coronavirus. So I would really recommend going to the web link there and looking at what there is. If you have concerns about mental health, I would recommend the Young Minds and the NSPCC websites, which have, rich resources. BBC on learning, Bitesize, is getting better and better, and I enjoy them, and I'm really, I would recommend, if you want to augment some of the learning that's going on at home in a really nice, accessible way, have a look at the BBC Bitesize website. There's a fantastic blog called the Chatterpack blog that has got such a broad collection of resources for home learning. Have a look at that. There's all sorts of things, and lots of ebooks and audio books and things like that as well. And finally, bereavement. Sadly, one of the things that's happened to an awful lot of families is they've had to deal with sudden bereavements under conditions that have been really, really difficult. There are 2 websites there that I would refer you to if you're dealing with bereavement in your family. The first is Winston's Wish, and the second is Cruse. So, hopefully that collection addresses most of the issues that people might want to follow up on.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And as I said, these links are going to be on our web pages as well. So it's really for me to just sort of close up at this point and say, thank you very much to my guest, Professor Sandra Dunsmuir, for a really fascinating discussion and all the practical, helpful suggestions you've provided. Next week, we're going to be talking about moving from the world of home education to a more business environment and discussing the importance of understanding consumer behavior and how we can still be doing that in the era of COVID.